All right, welcome everyone to our online class. So, this week we are going to be looking at the Roman Empire, and we're actually going to be spending 2 weeks in ancient Rome. There is a lot to look at. We'll be looking at the city of Rome, we'll be looking at Roman sculpture, painting, and we'll be looking at its colonies. We'll look at the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and that'll take us into the Byzantine world, which will be our next unit. Now, how long we'll be doing online lectures, I'm not sure, but for now, we're just gonna roll with it. So, this week, like I said, we're gonna start with an introduction to the Roman world. Now, you'll notice we don't have a daily analysis and we won't have a minute reflection here on this online platform. Instead, what you'll be doing is you will be watching this video and answering some discussion questions below. And then in the next, in the same module, we'll have another discussion question with some documentary clips. So I'm trying to imitate class as much as possible here. All right, so let's start with the map of the Roman world because y'all know I love a good map. Here we see the space where the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire is going to develop. Of course, it doesn't start as a world superpower, it starts as a small city state, very similar to what we've seen in developing in Greece. Now, Greece is still going strong at the same time that Rome is starting to develop, but Rome is going to be a very militarily aggressive city state, and they are soon going to be taking over most of the Italian peninsula. Of course, remember, there was no such thing as Italy back then, it was just a land that was up for grabs. And we're going to see how at the peak of the Roman Empire, most of this map is going to be part of Rome. Here we can see the development from Rome at the start of the Republic, then the area that is added after the Punic Wars, more land added, and the area in red is the Roman Empire at its height. So you can see where they have taken control of that Mesopotamian region where we started, ancient Egypt, because remember, that is the breadbasket of the world. So they are, of course, going to want to take control of Egypt. But they also take control of a lot of the rest of northern Africa, including Carthage, of course. They're going to be in Spain, up in Gaul, which is modern day France, part of Germany, and they're going to make it all the way through Britain. Now, what is happening at the same time that the Roman Empire is at its peak? Well, we're going to see that Rome is mostly going to be trading along the Silk Roads, as most of these other empires that are developing in Eurasia are also going to be participating in this trade. Now, in China, you have the Han Dynasty, and you will later have the Tang Dynasty. And what they are trading with the Chinese is silk. We're going to see later on how lavish the lifestyles of the noble women in ancient Rome were. And so they all wanted to be decked out in silk. And of course, silk comes from silkworms, but nobody back then knew this. So the Chinese guarded this as a state secret and they wouldn't let anybody leave with a silkworm. Of course, later on, that information came out and other people were able to produce silk, but for this time period, it was very much the monopoly of China. Now, the Chinese did not want a whole lot from the Roman Empire. They did trade in some ceramic wares and some metal work, but for the most part, the Chinese wanted um, horses from the Near East, right? So they did not necessarily want a lot of the Roman goods that were being produced at this time. So it was very much cash flowing from the Roman Empire into the Chinese Empire and not the other way around. Here is a better map to show this. Now, I brought in this timeline specifically because I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Roman history. You'll notice I often talk about the Roman Empire as opposed to the Roman Republic, but I'm really just generalizing here. Rome, we could have an entire semester's class talking about just the Roman Republic or just the Roman Empire. So when I'm talking about Rome, sometimes I'll be specific and talk about a particular time period, or I'm just talking in general. So here we see in 753 before the Common Era, Romulus founds Rome. Of course, this is the creation story of Rome. Some other important time periods, we saw the expansion of the Punic Wars that Rome fought against Carthage. So that was in 264 to around 146 before the Common Era. Now, of course, 44 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar is murdered on the Ides of March, an infamous date. And then we're going to pass year zero. And of course, our calendar is based off of the Christian calendar. That's what we're looking at here. And so we'll talk a little bit more about Christianity a little bit later on. But then 80 years after year zero, we see that the Colosseum is built in Rome. Then the years 96 to about 180 are called the Pax Romana, so the time period of the good emperors. And now, what makes a good emperor? These just happen to be emperors that were strategic. They were able to expand the empire, but still keep peace within the larger empire. And we'll talk more about that later on because a lot of them are going to do building projects for the empire, and that's really what interests us. Now, in 306 in the Common Era, Rome becomes a Christian empire. This is an incredibly important date. Like I said, we'll be talking more about Christianity in our next unit, but just so you have this in the back of your mind. In from around 410 to 476, Rome is sacked by the Goths and the other barbarians, and this is what is considered the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire is going to continue for another 1,000 years, and we'll talk more about them again in our next unit, but just have this as a general timeline of important events of the Roman Empire. Now, I want to take a specific look at the city. Now, if you haven't seen the video in your readings that gives you a three-dimensional look over the city, I suggest you go back and watch this. It's a wonderfully produced film which kind of shows you and gives you an idea of what ancient Rome would look like. Because if you go to Rome today, of course it's shut down right now, but if you were to go to Rome and it was open and everything was like normal, the city is really a 17th, 18th century city. It is not the ancient Rome. All of that is underground. And of course, they're never able to build a subway in Rome. They only have two lines. And every time they try to expand the lines, they get shut down because they hit a Roman ruin. Now, a little bit about ancient Rome. So, we are going to see a population of over 1 million people living in ancient Rome. That is huge compared to any other previous population. This is a diverse and cosmopolitan city. Remember, I talked about the Silk Roads. There's people from throughout Eurasia, there's people from Africa, there's people from Northern Europe. Everybody is coming to the city of Rome. Now, this is a consumer city, meaning they are bringing in goods from outside of the city. This is why the empire and the colonies are important. A lot of things are being imported, say, from Egypt or from other parts of the empire. Now, as wonderful as this city is, it's also dirty, dangerous, and chaotic. There were plagues, there was very little police control of any kind. There Although sanitation was pretty advanced, and we're going to see they have the cloaca maxima, most people that were poor did not have regular access to a toilet where they lived. And so you can imagine all of these people crammed together. Disease is rampant, and life in the city was dangerous. All right, so this is a uh, diagram of what ancient Rome looked like. Now, you're all familiar with the Colosseum. We see that circular building over here. But perhaps you're not as familiar with the Circus Maximus. And we're going to come back to the circus when we look at the Byzantines, because remember, the Byzantines are going to think of themselves as Romans, but there's going to be much more emphasis on chariot racing, which was what took place at the circus. Now, a little bit about urban life in Rome. Right? So you have three different levels of society. So you have at the very top the patricians. So these would have been senators, they would have been the emperor, they would have been noble people, people at the very top of society. Then you had plebeians, and this is sort of your middle class, and everybody kind of fits in within the plebeians. There are everybody from a bread maker, which was surprisingly enough a very high level job, to everything from latrine cleaner, right? And then at the very bottom, you have slaves and freedmen. And this is a chance for me to talk a little bit about slavery in the ancient world. Now, slavery in the ancient world was brutal, it was cruel, but it was absolutely nothing like we think of slavery in our own United States history. Slavery had nothing to do with the color of your skin. You could become a slave if you fell into debt. You could become a slave if your parents sold you because of that. You could become a slave if you were captured during war or during the takeover of a particular city state. So there were a lot of reasons why somebody might fall into slavery. Once they were a slave, life was not easy. However, this was not slavery for life. People could eventually buy their way out of slavery or be released from slavery. Their children would not be born slaves. And once they were freed, they could apply to become Roman citizens. So, a little bit more about Roman culture. So, what we're going to see in Roman culture is a tension between tradition, right? So the original tradition of the Roman city state, it is going to be a lot more reserved, a lot more military than the Eastern lifestyles. And of course, there we are talking about the Greeks. The Greeks are considered to be hedonistic people, meaning they like the good things in life, but they indulge a little too much. Remember, the Greeks love beauty, and the Greeks love themselves. So the Romans are going to see them as a little bit too over dramatic in some ways. Now, Roman culture is also a slave driven society. This is incredibly important. Large populations of the Roman Empire and the city of Rome were slaves, right? We are going to see changing roles for women throughout the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The image that you see here is of a marriage between a man and woman. So there are times when women are going to have the ability to divorce their husbands, to own land, which are two very important things for women's rights. However, there are going to be other times where women's rights are much more restricted. And one of the key things that I look at when I think about the role of women in ancient Rome is just the way that they were named. So you were named after your father. So if your father's name was Julius, what do you think that your name would be? Julia, right? Now, what if he has two daughters? Well, then she becomes Julia the second. And that's where we get a lot of our names from. Claudius becomes Claudia, Claudia the third, right? So women really are seen as extensions of their fathers, which tells us they are not going to have the same type of liberties and freedoms that we see, for example, in our society today. Now, the last bullet point here is the ability to become Roman. And that, of course, is pivotal because it's going to keep the empire homogenous because you're going to have people from all walks of life, different religions. The Romans are going to be, in this way, very similar to the ancient Persians. They're going to let people practice their own religion as long as they include the Roman Empire emperor in there. They're going to let them have their own governors, do their own things, as long as they're paying tribute. But what the Romans also do is they create a sense of being Roman. And so people want to learn Latin and they want to act in a Roman way because it becomes the standard. And so the ability to become Roman is going to be a big deal. Now, I will say this, I forgot in the previous slide, I talked about patricians, plebeians, slaves, and freedmen. Well, where do women hang out in this pyramid? Well, women are a step above perhaps slaves. Again, at times they're going to have a little bit more freedom, but as you'll see later when we talk about the Colosseum, they are often seated all the way at the top with the slaves. Now, about Roman lifestyles. So, if you were wealthy, if you were one of these patricians, this is the type of villa that you would live in the city of Rome. They lived in these massive villas. They would have a kind of a townhouse, and then they would have a villa out in the countryside. They lived extravagant lives, so they would have kitchens within their villas. They would have food from all over the empire. They would have their own bathrooms and multi storied buildings. They would dress in silks and go to parties and all of these sorts of things that were very much privileges and extravagances during this time. They would have feasts almost every day and they wore beautiful clothing with golden jewelry and gemstones from all over the empire. These are two other examples. You can see how they brought in a garden, right? You can see how most of this is still kind of post and lintel construction as well. But you have an atrium and it's very much open to the elements because Italy, again, has a pretty good climate. Now, the walls of all of these villas would have been painted in beautiful, colorful frescoes. And we've seen frescoes before, we'll see them again. And these are just wonderful. This is a reconstruction, but I think I have some. This is attempted linear perspective in Pompeii. So this comes to us. Many of the frescoes we have today come from Pompeii because it was preserved. Now, what we can see here is we see the Romans really grappling with trying to recreate three-dimensional space. Now, it's not perfect like we're going to see in the Renaissance, but it's pretty darn close, and everything looks very realistic, which was the goal of these frescoes. Right? You can see here a lot of architectural detail, which makes me really happy, but you can see the use of those Corinthian columns that we talked about last class. The architecture looks very Greek, and of course this is because the Romans, although they're going to think that the Greeks are hedonistic, they're also really going to love their art and architecture. Here is another room with an original couch. The cushions are new, of course. And this is another fresco, which is in the museum, a museum in Rome. I forget which one. All right, so what if you were poor? Now, the very bottom of the barrel, as it were, is if you're jobless, you're living under a bridge, you have no food. But one step above that is being kind of a middle class individual. All right, now these middle class individuals lived in apartments with no running water, no toilets, and no kitchen. It's basically just a room. Right? Now, apartment buildings often burned down and were fatal for families that were living on the top floors, and that is why, as opposed to today, the poorest people lived at the very top. Remember, there's also 7 to 8 floors and there's no elevators. So the wealthiest families, which would have been merchant families or families of, say, a scribe or somebody kind of with a higher up position, would have lived right above the shops. So the ground floor would have been shops. Then you would have had the entire floor dedicated to a family. So these would have been kind of larger homes. And then as you get higher and higher, these become very small rooms where you see either um, groups of men living dormitory style or entire families living in one room. Now, people of this social class usually had very simple diets, mainly consisting of bread, because bread was provided by the government. Now, you didn't get bread, you got flour, and then you had to take it to the baker because you didn't have a kitchen for them to bake it. You can see in this picture, there's also this guy throwing something suspicious out the window. And we'll talk more about like if there's no bathrooms in the apartments, where do you go? Right. Now, if you were of the social class, of course, you did not have spare clothing. You perhaps had one outfit, which was what you wore all the time. And these are actual apartment buildings that remain from the Roman time period. And that is so incredible to see that we still have these around, because usually we only have the homes of the wealthy, but we have apartment buildings. I know they're not much to look at, and you can imagine there would have been 5 to 7 floors of these, and they were stacked one against each other so that you could look out your window and actually literally almost touch the person in the building next to you. Right? And you can see here where you have the shops at the very bottom. You have kind of these wealthier apartments for the upper middle class individuals. And then the rooms get smaller and smaller the higher up you go. This is another sketch. And another one. Now, of course, where are you going to eat if you don't have a kitchen? Well, you would go to a tavern or a bar. Now, this, of course, is if you are a man. Usually, the only women that went to taverns and bars were sex workers. So, if you were a respectable woman, you would not be seen in one of these places. This is, again, a bar and tavern. I believe it's from Pompeii because it's in really great condition. And we can see all around there were frescoes of the types of activities that people would do at the taverns and bars, such as gamblings and finding sex workers and all of that sort of thing. And this would also be a place where men would hang out and talk and chat. Again, it is mostly a male only type of environment. Also, if you were a patrician, you would not have been found dead at a tavern or bar because, of course, you have access to your kitchen. So, this is very much not a classy sort of place. And the public toilets. I'll just let you look at this for a second. Now, you might be wondering, where are the stalls? Well, that's a really good question. There are no stalls. So you would go in here, these are the public toilets. There were no separating, dividing walls here. You just kind of took your seat and went. And I had a student ask me a couple semesters ago were there different restrooms for men and for women. Now there are certain places like the baths where there were, but other places these were just the bathrooms, and you just kind of went where you had to go. Of course, if you are a wealthier individual, you have a running bath toilet in your home, right? You would have a sewage system connecting to it. However, if you're poor, of course, this is your only opportunity to go in a sanitary way. Now, am I assuming it's going to be 2 a.m. in the morning and people are going to run down 7 flights of stairs and down the street to use the restroom? Probably not. And this is what caused a lot of disease within the city. All right. No, I think I'm going to wrap it up there, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of buildings that were found both in the city of Rome and in Roman colonies. And we'll talk a little bit more about those Roman colonies next week. So, this will be it for our lecture today. Thank you for listening in.